I'm Amira, and this is the Politics of Bits. This podcast is a special series that will run between now and inauguration. Last week, the U.S. had a major election. We waited for months for the outcome, and in the end, it was quite decisive. Former President Trump will be president again. The Republicans will take control of the Senate. And while we're not quite sure at the time of recording, it appears that the Republicans will have control of the House as well. This election was important for so many reasons, and these have been covered by many people in many different mediums. Here specifically, we're digging into what it means for crypto policy. Over the coming weeks, we'll hear from experts at the intersection of tech and policy to help us unpack what the role of crypto was in this election and what we should expect now that we have the results. To kick us off, we have Sheila Warren, CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation, one of the world's leading crypto advocacy groups. Sheila is one of the best placed people in the world to help us understand what to expect now that the election results are in. We chat about where we expect key legislation to go and who the key players are in crypto policy in the new administration in Congress. We also talked about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, which is how we can keep crypto policy bipartisan. We hope you enjoy, and if you have suggestions for future episodes or topics you want us to touch on, please get in touch. All right, welcome to the Politics of Bits. For our first episode, we have Sheila Warren, CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation, one of the world's leading crypto advocacy groups. Sheila, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Amira. It's great to be here.
So we're here to talk all things 2024 election and where we go from here. And I think you're one of the best placed people in the world to help us do that. But I thought before getting into what's next, we're going to spend a beat on how we got here, because I think a lot of people in crypto expect the election of Donald Trump and the fact that the Republicans won the Senate and are likely to win control of the House of Representatives to be a pretty good thing for crypto. And I want to settle into sort of where we think President Trump's interest in crypto has come from and, what that evolution has looked like. And I know we were texting a little bit over the weekend. Would love to hear sort of your thoughts on how you think we got to the place where the speculation is former and future President Trump is interested in crypto.
Yeah, well, it's a particularly wild situation if you kind of zoom out, right? Because all of us will recall the first Trump administration, which was not particularly crypto-friendly, to say the least. We had the midnight rule, we had the Clayton enforcement actions and things that came down in lawsuits, including the famous, now infamous, I would say, Ripple suit. So it's quite the 180 in terms of where things are poised to be with the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration. I do think that is a sincere change of heart or opinion or whatever you want to call it, right? I do think that is legitimate and real. We shouldn't, of course, forget what happened before because we're still feeling the ripple, if I may, effects of that to this day. But I do think that there has been a change of position at the very top of the ticket, namely with former president, soon-to-be President Trump. And how that happened, I think, is a combination of the market moving where it moved, the stickiness of the crypto industry, specifically Bitcoin, being inarguable and unassailable, which is an opinion, but I also think that's borne out by the evidence over the course of the last almost 4 years, right? If you thought this thing was a flash in the pan in, 2017, it seems pretty crazy to think that going into 2025, there's been all of that evidence in between of where this thing, where this thing is now, this industry is. So I think that's one piece of it. It's just the sort of unassailable evidence and facts on the ground. But the other piece, of course, is efforts by a variety of actors to actually get in with the president and have conversations with him and his advisors. So I think it's a combination of all of those things that's important. And then, lastly, to that second point, I would say it is observing the crypto industry's reactions to the Biden administration's posture on this industry, which, to say the least, was not well received, right? And so understanding that not only was not well received as policy positions, it also resulted in political money and other kinds of contributions, all of that happening in this election cycle. So I think it's a practical, at a minimum, it'd be a practical position. But in this case, I do think that there is sincerity in the sort of change of heart, if you will, in the belief that this industry and certain of these assets are critical to the financial future of the world and the global economy.
So I think that's really helpful grounding. So let's talk about where we're at today and going into next year. So we have a situation where former President Trump has won the presidency. The Republicans have control of the Senate. They're likely to have control of the House. Um, one of the things I think is really interesting is a lot of people in crypto say like, hey, this clean sweep is going to be really positive for the industry. And there's a number of different reasons people think that. But one of the things that I have questions about is it actually a priority, right? So an incoming administration has a bunch of different things that they're thinking about. There's tax policy, there's immigration. And I'm curious where you think crypto, as they think about sort of the first 100 days or sort of the first piece of legislation they get out there, like where does crypto line up in its priorities list? And then we can go down and talk about appointments, different pieces of legislation. But a high level, how much are President Trump and his advisors thinking about crypto?
So Steve Scalise, who runs a Republican conference, he put out this letter, it's called a Dear Colleague letter, and it basically tells Republicans, hey, here's what we're thinking at this moment in time. And he put that out, I think the day after the election, sometime earlier this week. Or last week, sorry. And in it, he talks about, the first 100 days. And this is findable. It's a Googleable document. So I'd encourage people to take a look if they're curious about this. There's a lot in it. The top 100-day agenda, what he talks about is locking in the Trump tax cuts. There's three things in bold, right? Lock in the Trump tax cuts, unleash American energy. So a lot about the energy industry and energy exploration, and then resources to the southern border. Building the wall. Okay, so those are sort of the 100 days things. But then he goes through and he talks about these other things that they think are really important. There's some sort of like philosophical points in here, which is pretty standard, right, stuff when the parties change. But then he goes through and he has this agenda that lists things that they want to do. Okay, and so a bunch of these are ideological. That won't be surprising. I think let me just count 1, 2, 3. More than half of them are ideological, so we'll leave those aside. There are a couple that are about foreign policy, including one about national security threats posed by China. So that's important. Let's pause on that for a moment because that's important, I think, to our conversation today. And then there are 3 that talk about tech. And I'll read those verbatim just so your listeners can hear them. So one is promoting American innovation, such as AI, around the world to ensure we remain the global leader. Second is keeping government out of the way so innovation in the startup community can flourish. And the third one, wait for it, establishing a regulatory framework for digital assets to allow this industry to grow with certainty. Okay, so all 3 of those indicate a very tech-forward, innovation-forward, startup-forward, let's call it a tech-positive, environment. But what I found interesting was this recognition of the global stage. Okay, that's explicitly articulated. I mean, every word here was chosen specifically. Okay, you should assume that. And then also this idea of a regulatory framework for digital assets to allow the industry to grow. I think that is also really interesting. Now, the question becomes, so these are the priorities as stated, okay? And then there's a lot of other stuff in here. There's stuff about, education and colleges and freedom of speech and all this other stuff. But these made the list. And so there's every indication that they're going to take this very seriously. Now, your question still remains, okay? You can say all these things, but when you talk about priorities, there's 2 questions. One is, where does it fall on the priority list? But I don't personally think you should read too much into where something falls on a list. Like if it's on a list, whatever, right? There's going to be opportunities to do things and not do things. The second is what can you get done when and how, which is I think the more important question. So it's been no question for a lot of this campaign since Bitcoin Nashville that there was interest and and dedication to moving the regulatory agenda forward for crypto. But the question is how and when. So there's lame duck. There's 100 days with executive orders and things like that. Then there's the next Congress. And the question becomes what can happen where? Now, something like establishing a regulatory framework for digital assets, well, that's interesting. Now, let's kind of back into it, right? So we know that when administration changes from one party to another, one of the things that changes is leadership of federal agencies, administrative agencies. That leadership changes, okay? The ordinary course is the standing party has a chair. That chair either resigns or, steps back to being a regular commissioner. That's very unusual, but it does happen. And they put into place a new commissioner. That involves, if it's a brand new person, hearings. You have to take them through Congress. Certain committee appointments require hearings, others don't. Certain agency appointments require hearings, some don't, et cetera. You got to take people through a process. Or you can promote an existing person at an agency and make them, right, the chair or the whatnot. Or you can try to shove through what's called a recess appointment. Okay. So President Trump, former and soon to be President Trump, has put out all of this language and rhetoric that's like, we need to shove through recess appointments and get all these people into these agencies like right now, fast. Okay, and there's going to be a lot of push.
I think is like pretty, I don't mean to interrupt you, I think it's pretty unusual and pretty interesting, right? Because to me, it signals that he is very focused on process in a way that I think was not true in 2016. Like he is very aware of this.
Yes. And keep in mind, the Democrats still control the Senate. Their priority, which they haven't necessarily said out loud that I've seen, but is really, really, really obvious, is going to be the judiciary. They're going to get through as many judges as possible in this, because when you look at the points in Scalise's agenda, they're going to focus on the social, ideological questions the most, right? So are they going to be in a position where they're going to fight about, there might be some deal making that happens. Like they know they're going to have agency turnover. Are they going to fight about that or allow recess appointments and try to barter or trade and say, we'll do these judges, you do this. And there's all of this horse trading happens all the time. And so we're going to have to see how this sort of plays out and what happens here. The other thing that's really important is who are going to be committee chairs of the various committees in Congress. So maybe we can take it piece by piece. We can take sort of like those time periods, right? You tell me what you want to do. We can go lame duck, appointments, right? All this new Congress, we can talk about different branches of government.
Because we're doing all of it. I think let's stick with what we're going to right now, which I think is really interesting. The piece of like people or policy, right? Because I think a lot of times it's really easy if you're not really intimately involved in what's going on in DC to look at what's in text or look at sort of the legislative agenda and scrutinize, I think, the policy piece. But really it matters who's going to be in these seats, who's being put forward to different seats. And that happens both, let's break it down, in the executive branch, in different agencies like you talked about. And I think notably the SEC when it comes to crypto, but also the CFTC, Treasury, so forth. And then also who the committee chairs are in Congress. So let's take a beat and stick with the executive branch for a little bit and talk about I don't want to get too caught up in sort of name salad, but, let's talk about like where is interesting in the executive branch to look out for and what maybe some of the big names or what at a high level do you look for as an indication of where future President Trump's head is at on this issue?
Yeah. So let's context set here, right? So everyone in crypto, knows the bête noire of crypto is Gary Gensler, chair of the SEC. Okay. And we have worked really hard to say and be very careful about saying the SEC is not a monolith, right? Gary Gensler is the chair. He sets the broad agenda. He controls the resources. He's like the CEO of the thing. So if you understand how businesses work, you understand what that means and what it also doesn't mean, right? But there are plenty of folks at the SEC who have different views about the digital asset industry and in general about other topics as well, okay? So when we were first kind of talking through SEC, CFTC, where do we want jurisdictional authority to lie? What are the boundaries? I would always push people to say, look, imagine a way Gary Gensler, hard to do, but imagine a way, right? And then you have to kind of like in the abstract, think about, is this the right agency or not? Abstracted from an individual. And so to your point, I say that to just say, your point about the person really, 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 really matters. Because you can imagine if there were a different person who had a different agenda, maybe their agenda was all about, I don't know, ESG or investors or whatever. They didn't have this like bee in their bonnet, to use one of my favorite expressions, about digital assets for whatever unknown reason. You'd have a very different set of outcomes for this industry, even if you had somebody who was kind of neutral on our topic, right? So it really, really matters. Okay, now, there's the way that I think it's very, very clear. President Trump has said he's going to fire Gary Gensler. Okay, whether Gary Gensler fires or resigns, whatever. The point is, there's no question Gary Gensler is not going to be the chair of the SEC once Trump takes office. Period. Full stop. Now, I will again remind people that we had under President Trump, Secretary Mnuchin's famous midnight rule. Okay,
remind people what that is.
Yes. So Secretary Mnuchin, who again was as you noted, was a very senior person in the Trump administration, and who hadn't necessarily, what's interesting about this contextually is he hadn't necessarily been anti-crypto. I mean, I knew that because I'd seen him speaking in Davos about crypto and being very, very anti-Bitcoin specifically, but I don't think that was like super widely publicly known about him. Nevertheless, at kind of like the last minute 11th hour, he tried to promulgate this rule on self-hosted wallets. And like, long story short, again, people can like look this up. It's pretty well known, in our industry, but it was like pretty much like it was one of the loudest shots across the bow, like taking on, at that point in time, imagine this, right? This is December 2020. Taking on self-hosted wallets was a pretty wild swing to come out of administration that had not been positive about crypto at all, but had not necessarily been like super anti-crypto, okay? And that was called a midnight rule because it came out in December, and it was like this sort of, people were like winding down to vacation and the holidays, and it was just this sort of like, the timing of it was very, deliberate,
Also middle of COVID, right? So like a lot of other stuff happening.
Yes. I had completely forgotten that context, but you're totally right. Like, it seems like forever ago, but you're
that
absolutely
Treasury
right.
could be dealing with in the midnight ruling.
A lot going on, right? And of course, Trump had lost the election, and we were looking at Biden, coming in. So it was kind of this last ditch effort to land something. Now, at that time, there were several people who remain relevant to crypto today. Tom Emmer, leading the charge on this to say, don't do this. But basically, he was trying to regulate self-hosted wallets in ways that didn't really make any sense, weren't fit for purpose, and moving on from that, right? So the point of that is, there is a lot that can be done in this period of time before a new administration comes on board. And I think there's already been a lot of sort of concern that Chair Gensler will try to issue a flurry of enforcement actions or Wells or whatever it is, something to try to land his final shots and his final points before he is, out of office, essentially. So we're not done yet. And it's important for him to remember that this is still the Biden administration. It's a democratically led Senate. It's a Republican House with Patrick Henry on financial services. That is who we have until inauguration. That's who we have. So that has not changed. It doesn't, just because you win an election does not mean things change until the inauguration and new people take office, right? So that's just a really important set of context. I think people keep forgetting this, and it's important to note that we had this situation, and that's when Mnuchin came in and tried to and did this self-hosted wallet regulation that was brutal, basically brutal.
So TLDR, like be on the lookout, and the people still matter, even though
Yes.
the election has happened, and we'll see new people come through. And so
you still have power. You still have power till you don't, right? Let me put it that way.
Right. And so let's take a look at, there's like parlor games around DC, I think at this point, which is like a lot of speculation of who's going to be in what agency, who's getting power where. I would love just like the gossip that you're hearing right now. Where are we hearing about? One, what are some of the key positions? And two, like, what are you hearing about who's going to be where? Maybe not in like you don't have to say like this person is definitely going to be chair of X, but like names being tossed around. What agencies are even interested in the first place?
Yeah. So I will start by landing where you started, which is this is all gossip. And this is sort of like the wild season where everyone's trying to throw a hat in the ring. There's tremendous amounts of posturing. So you really have to take all of this with not just a grain of salt, but like an absolute like pillar of salt, because like it's all going to shake out over the course of the next period of time. And right now, what really matters are the transition team appointments. Okay. So we know some of those names are in the press of people who are kind of leading that. Howard Lutnick and others are very critical and key in Linda McMahon, of who's like transitioning, like figuring out what are their priorities, how do we move things, how do we get appointments set, all of that stuff is a transition team. Then you have the administration, the appointments. Okay. So right now we're still letting transition team people. Will there be a crypto advisor? Almost certainly. There's kind of a bunch of people that might be. Will they take an appointment later? Probably not. So it all remains to be seen. But to your question about appointments, I think it's important to look at three agencies, which are obvious: the SEC, the CFTC, and the FTC. Okay. Now, the thing to know, there's already been public speculation and it's hit the press about Gail Slater potentially being FTC chair, replacing Lena Khan. Her name is certainly in the mix. Will she be it or not? It's too soon to tell. There'll be other folks as well who come through. There'll be a lot of discussion around these kinds of questions. For the SEC, we do have two commissioners right now who are Republican and who are people who have been the dissenters on much of Chair Gensler's actions. Okay. And that's Mark Yetta and Hester Peirce. Hester Peirce who is called like the grandmother of crypto or godmother of crypto or something like that.
It's crypto mom, right?
Crypto mom. Thank you. I was like, there's something else. Crypto mom. That's right. And Giancarlo's crypto dad. Crypto mom. She's very knowledgeable on our issues. She's met a lot with folks in industry, but she's also said publicly prior to this election that she didn't want another term. So making her chair for the year remaining in her term, that's a move. But will they do that? I don't really know. Mark Yeda has a longer leg. He also he's been silent from what I know. He's actually expressed that he would consider, let's say more positively, another term. So that's somebody that could be there longer potentially. They have both already been through their hearing process. So they are commissioners right now. Promoting them to chair is a decision that Trump can just make. There's no other process around it. If you have an acting commissioner, you can move them up to the chair position without any further kind of action. So if you're really serious about a functioning SEC, you want to move fast, the move is to take one of the two of your party, the minority party, move one of them to the chair, and then go through a process to get the other seat filled their replacement seat filled with somebody else. So that's kind of how that tends to work. We could also expect that this will flip to a 3-2 SEC with 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. However, we're in like a time when nothing ever really goes. We can't assume everything's going to go according to how it's ever gone in the past, okay? So Gary Gensler's term does not expire, to be very clear, okay? As chair, he serves the pleasure of the president, and that is going to be a done thing. But he still could technically be a commissioner, which is wild, right? And so there may have to be this like firing process. This is just, the history of this is not necessarily something I've read, hundreds of years about, but like, usually people just resign because that's the appropriate thing to do. But like, is that going to happen this time? Would it surprise us if Gary Gensler tried to stick around? I don't really know. But regardless, the chair will be a different person. Okay. Then moving to the CFTC, similarly, Summer Merchant or Caroline Fan, Republicans, knowledgeable on the issues, would one of them take it? Will it be offered? Who knows? Right? But there are people there that already could do the job, that know these topics quite well, and that would be eligible to get promoted into the chair position. For the FTC, it's pretty clear they want net new, a fresh person that they bring in, goes through hearings, etc. And that seems to be the stance they're taking, it's a different thing. The commissioner kind of composition is different there as well. But those are the 3 I would say are important to be paying attention to.
So, let's spend a beat talking about why the FTC is important, because I think, talking about the FTC is common in tech circles, but I think is less common in crypto specifically.
Yeah. So we're at a point in our industry where you'd ordinarily expect a bunch of mergers and acquisitions to happen. We're kind of in M&A season. And for those who aren't familiar, this is a pretty common thing that happens when an industry gets to sufficient kind of size. People will build like a piece of a thing and someone else will want to acquire it. And so they'll buy it, right? This is how Google got where it got. This is how Meta got to be Meta, et cetera, right? And the FTC has taken a very, very strong antitrust stance. Antitrust, of course, is the idea that you don't want to have monopolies within systems. You want to have fair competition, et cetera, okay? So the most famous thing that happened was the Adobe Figma deal not being approved. This was a deal for Adobe to buy Figma. This isn't a crypto thing, but just a general tech thing. It caused a lot of discussion in the Valley. To say it was like the topic for like about a month is like all anybody was talking about was the denial by the FTC of this acquisition opportunity, and what that meant for tech in general. Okay, now say what you will about all of that and Lena's stance on this, and I actually think within crypto we tend to be about decentralization and we don't like monopolies. So there's an element of this that I think, ironically, should resonate with crypto community, but the way that this has been gone about happening has been very unpopular with founders and with venture capitalists in particular, both of whom, of course, are part of the crypto ecosystem. So transitioning that, the other thing to note is that Lena Khan is a protege of Elizabeth Warren. And so there was kind of this idea that she was taking direction from Liz Warren, et cetera. Anyway, regardless, all of that is going to change. And now you're going to see the opportunity for more of this kind of activity, for better or for worse. And I personally think there are better and worse aspects to this, because I do think that we want to have competition. That's really important. I think part of the reason I got into crypto personally is I was very concerned about the FANG kind of concept that you're going to have just a handful of companies that dictate everything we do online. I don't like that. But I think there are kind of ways of doing it that honor kind of founders and honor the effort it takes to start a business from scratch in a very complicated technological area, et cetera. And there's no question that the prospect of growth within these businesses has led founders to want to found them within the United States. Okay, so the FTC is sort of parallel. It's of a parallel relevance to us. They don't regulate digital assets or crypto, but they regulate how a market can function in ways that are meaningful and important to anybody who's founding or anybody who's building in particularly a new technology area.
Great. All right. So we talked a lot about the sort of three-letter agencies. Let's pivot and start talking about the world post-January 20th when it comes to legislation, because I get a lot of questions about when we're going to see crypto legislation, if we're going to see it, and what the sort of key jumping off points are. So let's just start thinking about whether or not we think we'll see crypto legislation in the first 6 months, first 12 months, and if so, like which legislation might move, and then we can dig in deeply into sort of which sort of one or two pieces might make the most sense to focus on.
Well, I think we have to go back and round out our discussion about the people.
This is
we
right.
Didn't talk
okay.
about,
Let's talk about
yeah,
committees.
we didn't talk about committees, okay? Because this is going to determine the priority list. So right now, one of the reasons crypto legislation has been such an active topic is Patrick McHenry. And for those who may not know who that is, he is the retiring chair of the House Financial Services Committee, which governs everything. They govern the SEC, they oversee the SEC, and they govern the digital assets area with respect to the SEC. And so Patrick McHenry and his counterpart on the Ag Committee in the House, G.T. Thompson, which oversees the CFTC, work closely
being
together.
Agriculture Committee, which people always think is funny, is involved in crypto, but it is.
They think it's funny too, by the way. I think we all think it's funny. And many of them are like, why is this funny? So they run the CFTC. They oversee the CFTC, rather, pardon my language. And so the two of them have a very close working relationship. And they came up together with Fit 21, which is the bill that made its way through the House. We supported it. We got bipartisan support around it, et cetera. And that was because those two worked together on SEC and CFTC issues. In previous Congresses, you've had animosity between those two chairs on occasion. You've had different priorities between those two chairs, right? For example, so getting a comprehensive market structure bill that addresses the SEC component and the CFTC component and which agency has jurisdiction over what and when and this and that, that is not always easy to accomplish. And I think something people just completely underestimate about Congress is how difficult it is and how much horse trading and how much reputational, relational knowledge and emotional intelligence you have to make deals. Because all you're doing, you're just making deals, right? The idea that people go there and they're like, I am suddenly going to become an expert on every single thing is not true. They're willing to move something forward because they're either getting something else or they're convinced it's important or they like the person asking them or that they owe that person a favor. It's a very, very, it's a deal-based kind of system, right? So in Patrick McHenry, he, for a variety of reasons, made this his number one priority, his legacy move, okay? Now, the next chair is probably going to be a gentleman named Andy Barr. And Andy Barr, while also a consummate politician, able to get things done, this isn't necessarily his top priority. He's got a bunch of things he wants to work on. Now, he will listen to party leadership. The fact that it made Steve Scalise's list that I talked about, digital assets, means he is going to take it seriously. At the same time, there's a lot of things they want to do. A bunch of these guys, like they want to, push back on the Fed is a big one for a lot of these guys. The ESG stuff, like Republicans are all, it drives them crazy. So pulling back sort of ESG stuff is really important. They really don't like the CFPB, an agency we didn't discuss, but Republicans do not like that agency. So trying to pull back on that agency. There's a lot of things. They have this weird thing about, say what you will, it's this flood insurance thing. There's a lot of sort of government spending stuff that they have on their plate. And, this may or may not slot in right away, okay? And frankly, there are some of those things that have broad relevance to their districts, right? To his district in Kentucky. Like all of this kind of stuff has to come into play. So it's not to say that there won't be movement, but the prioritization question really matters. Now, the other two who are in the running for this at the moment, and this could shift and change, are Rep. Huizinga and Rep. French Hill. And French Hill, for those who are following closely, he ran the digital assets subcommittee of financial services, making him one of the probably the most remaining knowledgeable congressmen who is going to exist on the Republican side in the House. Okay, if he gets that chair position, of course, he's going to lean into his area of expertise, which is digital assets. If he gets it, this goes a lot faster. Okay. So the timing does matter. It's not, I think this is going to get done regardless, but is it like number 1 or number 20 on the list? To some people, that really matters. To a lot of folks, doesn't matter that much in industry, but to some folks, it really, really, really matters. And it's dependent on that. Now, let's switch over to the Senate. Okay. In the Senate, we've got a number of folks who are big on crypto. Senator Haggerty is one of them, but he is being talked about for an administration position, possibly Secretary of State. So if he pulls up, he then is focusing on a totally different portfolio of issues. His support in the Senate is no longer a thing that we, count on. But we'll see. That all has to play out. Okay. You've also got Senator Lummis, who has been a long time, one of the earliest crypto advocates in the Senate. Possibility she'll get considered for a role as well, right? If she does, what happens there? If not, she will be a champion in the Senate for all these issues. Okay. The other thing that's happening right now is the fight for majority leader. McConnell is leaving. McConnell, I will note, never particularly supportive of digital assets, not against them, but not somebody who was pushing the agenda along at all. It was not a priority for him, okay, in any sort of really, really meaningful way. You've got Rick Scott and you've got John Cornyn and John Thune, who are all in the running for this position, with Rick Scott, as of recording, as of this moment, seeming to be the most likely new Senate Majority Leader. Rick Scott is great with digital assets, but he's not an expert. It's not his particular area of major expertise, okay? Cornyn and Thune, a little more about this, but none of these three has kind of cut their teeth on this topic and is like a deep, passionate advocate, right?
And why does it matter who's majority leader?
It's how you get things on the agenda. So right now, the reason why Chuck Schumer is so critically important is he decides it goes to the floor. So you can get something out of committee. Okay, so the Senate is organized into committees. There's judiciary, there's ag, there's banking, there's intelligence, there's armed services, whatever it is. And the chair of that committee gets to decide. They have hearings on topics, they craft bills, they get them through committee, et cetera. But then they have to get taken to the floor of the Senate for whatever process has to happen, usually hearing and vote, okay? Of some kind, discussion, amendments, all that stuff. And the majority leader decides the order of operations. What makes to the floor or not. They can slow roll something to death and not put it on the floor. That happens. Or they can prioritize something, or they can agree to take something and shove it together with something else. They have a tremendous amount of power. And one of the things that happened here was once Chuck Schumer got on board with digital assets, that stuff started moving a lot. Like there was momentum around it in the Senate. Okay. McConnell never had that momentum from his personal, priority list, but he was a minority leader, so it mattered less, right? The majority leader is the one who decides what comes through. And they basically set the calendar for what happens on the floor. And the reason that matters is there are only so many days on the floor. Now, at the start of a new Congress, there's plenty of time. So that's not an issue. You can imagine right now, there are very limited floor days in this lame duck session. And so Senator Schumer is deciding what gets to the floor. Most likely it's going to be judiciary, nominations, right, and judges, but it could be other things as well. And he has to pick and choose what goes through in limited floor time they're trying to advance before this Congress is over. So it's a tremendously powerful position for many, many reasons, but they are the determinants of basically what legislation gets passed.
Cool. Okay. So people are important and we got to figure out how they end up prioritizing different issues. Then let's talk about what actually substantively people might vote on. So we talked about Fit 21. I get a lot of questions is Fit 21 going to be the thing that we vote on? Should we be obsessing over the language in Fit 21? How much is that going to be the market structure legislation? Where do you see us actually coming up with what the legislation looks like? And you said you think this is going to happen regardless. What gives you confidence that this is going to happen?
Well, among other things, Steve Scalise putting it in his short list of things that he wants to see get done, okay, as the majority or the minority whip, soon to be majority whip. So, that is the agenda that's been set there. And that agenda could have had anything on it, and it has this on it. So I have every reason to believe that that is legitimate and sincere. And again, it's a matter of priorities. So I don't know when, but I think it is fair to say that that's going to go through. Okay. So the Steve Scalise letter, and just as a reminder, I'll pull it up and read it again. What he said was establishing a regulatory framework for digital assets to allow this industry to grow with certainty. Okay, a regulatory framework. So it isn't necessarily enough to have the right agency heads in place, although that's part of this, of course, because the agency has to determine the final regulations, right? So, okay, great. We know that's going to be set up. for success, right? For as far as the industry goes. But you also have to have the right mandate and authorization given to that committee. And the ongoing debate has been SEC or CFTC, SEC or CFTC, who gets to do what? Where does this sit? Who oversees these? Is it spot market? Is it the assets themselves? Are we changing securities? Whatever, all that stuff, you have to establish who has congressional authority. Who is Congress giving authority to which agency? So that takes an act of Congress, right? Congress has to legislate, and then the regulator can go off and do what they need to do. So what can happen immediately is that the SEC can stop prosecuting enforcement actions, issuing them, all of that. Okay, that is a decision from the enforcement side of an agency that the chair makes a decision about, and the enforcement in connection with the other commissioners, et cetera. Okay, but legislation is what kind of establishes the authority of the agencies to go forth and promulgate regulations, et cetera, et cetera. And part of what has been unclear is where does this fall? And the prevailing wisdom has been that an act of Congress is needed to establish which agency has what authority and when, et cetera. So you need this to move in order for that to happen. But it's complicated. It's always been complicated. And that's one of the reasons you get, it's taken a long time, longer than I think anybody would have hoped.
Yeah, and also I want to get back to this question of like, where does Fit 21 stand or other market structure legislation? But I'll push back a little bit, Sheila, which is we have congressional leaders and also presidents point out priorities at the beginning of their terms all the time, and these priorities don't all get passed. Ask again, like, what gives you confidence? Just because we have basically a full Republican sweep?
It's a great question. I'll tell you why. It's because you have the soon-to-be majority whip, right? And one of the most respected members of Congress on the Republican side and the president both saying this. Because there are times the president says a thing and Congress is like, whatever.
Yeah.
Great, fine. They don't always follow their president's agenda, right? And you can see this with Biden and Schumer, which I think there was quite a break there on a number of things. When people realize that or not, there was definitely a break in terms of the policy that was priority and how it was getting done. So just because Trump says something doesn't mean Congress is going to do it. But the fact that you have, and look, we don't know who the Senate majority leader is yet. That's why I said that's so important. If it's Rick Scott, if it's Cornyn, if it's Thune, it matters because they're going to have a loud voice in what this is and what the priorities are. But the fact that the current person, who is the very senior person, or Steve Scalise, is saying this, and Trump has also said it, that's what gives me confidence. And that's why I say the question is the timing, not so much the what. Now, I should also pause here because I think there is something industry is doing that I'm watching with, I've just been around too long, okay? There is an assumption that we're going to love whatever happens, okay? Things are going to move, but details really matter, okay? And I will say this, Patrick McHenry is one of the most knowledgeable people on digital assets in his team, okay? And one of the best politicians in Congress, period, full stop. He wrote a bill called Fit 21. He championed that. There were people in industry who hate that bill. Okay, it is hard to imagine a better champion than Patrick McHenry, who, by the way, had the majority in the House, only had to get through the House. The Senate was going to come differently, right? Did that, got bipartisan support. All of that was really important. But that's the bill that he got. And so it's important to remember Maxine Waters, who's the minority person on financial services, she's not going away. She has a point of view as well. And she also has a point of view on what gets through her committee, et cetera, et cetera. So people need to understand that you can have everyone saying all the things, and they can even be doing the things, but doesn't mean that the language that comes through, everyone's going to love, right? That is a reality that I think people are really glossing over, and I find it very interesting.
Because writing market structure legislation is quite complicated, right? It's not.
It is, as it turns out, it's very, 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 very hard.
So then let's talk through the what. What happens to Fit 21 from here? Is this the legislation that you think is going to get revived and pushed through?
So Patrick McHenry won't be here anymore. Okay, you're going to have a new person in charge of that committee who may or may not take parts of that text that got passed and move it through, right? But you kind of have to start over again. And so more likely, there'll be some parts of that text that get cut and paste, essentially copy pasted into something new and get taken forward, right? But don't forget, if you have an aligned Senate and House, the Senate is going to take a much bigger role in this drafting as well. And so you're going to have a Senate bill that comes through that may or may not mirror FIT, that will certainly benefit and learn from what happened in the FIT negotiation process for sure, but is going to have its own signatures on it, its own people drafting it, its own champions, its own detractors. All of that is going to happen. And because the parties are negotiating what they're different, you're going to get a different product. The idea that it's not like you, trying to think of a good metaphor here, and there's not really a good one, right? But like, think about, I'll try to do a TV metaphor. You have like a script you're pitching, okay? You're pitching it to a studio executive, and you take the pitch a certain way. And then the studio executive changes. They get fired, whatever. There's a new person. You might take the same script, maybe, but chances are you're going to massage it to who that person is, who that new exec is. You're going to talk about it differently, or you're going to change certain things about it to be more attractive and appealing to the person you're making the case to, right? Similarly here, you have different people who think about this differently. They have their constituents to think about. They have their party positioning to think about, where they sit in the party. Are they new? Are they not? Are they this? Are they that? Who do they owe favors to? Who owes favors to them? How strong is their relationship across the aisle with other committees? All of that becomes relevant. And it's totally different now. It'll be totally different in the new Congress than what we have now.
Okay, so FIT, like, probably we'll see pieces of it, but not the same thing come back wholesale. How do we feel about stablecoin legislation?
This has been look, I when I took this position almost exactly 3 years ago, the number one thing I said to anyone who asked, what's their priority? Stablecoin legislation. It should be in my opinion, remains to be the case, the number one priority of the U.S. government should be to pass stablecoin legislation, period, full stop. Of industry, different views. Of the U.S. government, this should be a gigantic priority, okay? We don't even have text, Amira. And I mean, you know this, right? So there are like pieces of text. There have been thoughts of text. There's a bunch of stuff that's pretty landed in bipartisan fashion. There's a bunch of stuff that's just never landed. And some of those people are still going to be around. Some are not, et cetera. The other thing to remember is that on the minority side, assuming that the Democrats lose the House, which is not certain yet as the time of this recording, but looking like that's probably the way it's going to go, it'll be very, very close. Regardless, you're going to have New York running the table on the minority side with Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer. And one of the issues of contention for stablecoins was something called federal preemption. To boil it down, how does the state sort of regulatory environment, the bit license, et cetera, how does that play into things with the federal government? So there's this whole question around preemption and federal versus state and all this stuff that's come into play.
And New York really cares because they have a very robust regulatory regime for crypto,
right.
Probably the most robust in the nation at the state level.
That's right. And you're going to have, it's not Nancy Pelosi in California anymore. It's Hakeem Jeffries in New York and Chuck Schumer in New York. Okay. Now, again, people, they are American public servants. They look out for the country. That's their job and the positions that they're in. But they're also New Yorkers who hear from New Yorkers who are New Yorkers themselves, who know about New York businesses, right? That certainly plays into how they're going to think about some of this stuff that goes forward. So all of these things are going to become differently complicated. They've been complicated already, differently complicated in the next Congress. But the idea that you have this smooth sailing path, that's not how any of this works. It's always complicated in Congress. It's easier if you have one party in both houses, for sure, in both chambers. It is easier, but it is not easy. It is not easy. It's never, ever, God help me, never easy.
Still very complicated. So
it's still very complicated.
I want to close on one sort of final question or thing to wax on, which is a story that I think the industry's been telling for the last few years, which I think there's truth to, is that there are founders and really talented developers in the United States who are leaving because we don't have a crypto regulatory regime. And my question is, do you think they're coming back? Like, what do you think is going to happen to sort of the share of US's competitiveness when it comes to crypto over the next few years?
So I think it's really important to look at this. Look, crypto is borderless, right? And it is a global opportunity, a global technology. And there are going to be jurisdictions that are already very friendly to crypto and have been for a while, which is, by the way, all of them, for the most part, are more friendly for the most part. I'm being facetious, but like most of them are pretty landed and have certainty around this. I do think companies that are HQ'd here are going to wait this out because it suits them best. But I think there are other things coming into play that are going to be really interesting to see. Immigration is a giant topic for this administration. They're saying certain things, they're going to do certain things. I actually don't know if it's going to get harder to get any kind of visa to come into the country. I don't know how that affects the talent pool. I just don't know. Okay. There might be people here who find those stances distasteful, and who want to go. And there's all kinds of things happening here that are very complicated, that are not just about the regulation of the industry, but are about the kind of general stance on talent, and migration that is really important as well. A lot of tech talent is already overseas. Developer talent is already overseas. Great, it might stay there, and you can certainly work. When I built my product, I worked with developers overseas all the time. Mine were Romanian. It doesn't really matter. You can do that very easily, but there is an interesting question about how are you thinking about where you're going to land your product. And not to mention, as the number starts to go up again, because I think we're all expecting, the bull market to really start to take off in this context. That was happening regardless, but now I think it's going to be a boost to that. You're going to see some of these markets really start to grow. So I'm talking about the African continent, South America, Latin America. A lot of these markets are going to come back that have very obvious use cases, and where a lot of very interesting build has been happening, sort of outside of the purview or outside of the sort of notice of a lot of folks who maybe live on crypto Twitter, right? But a lot of that work is really exciting. So I think you're going to see people that are also thinking about cost of living and making all kinds of decisions about the industry, knowing that they can address the US market regardless. There won't be this VPN thing. You're going to be able to come in and have US users in some time frame without having to worry about that. I don't know that it's obvious necessarily where people are going to kind of choose to locate their bodies, let alone their companies. But all this is to say, for U.S. companies HQ'd in the U.S., this is certainly a positive sign. And it's just a matter of time, I think, until there is the clarity we've been asking for. It's just a matter of when exactly that happens and what form specifically it takes.
I really appreciate your asking us to step back and think about that question holistically, because I think it'd be very easy to take a very single tack on it. And the reality is migration patterns where talent is so much more complicated than single-sided. I do have a last question that I wish I'd gotten to earlier, but yeah. I think it's really critical to close out on, which is, anyone can Google URI and know that we've been affiliated with the Democratic Party in the past. And I think one of the things that we say about crypto is that it's bipartisan. It should be a bipartisan issue. And one of my fears as we sort of keep marching into what I think is pretty partisan territory, is can we keep crypto bipartisan? And so I'd love to hear you wax on that a little bit. How do we keep crypto bipartisan?
Well, those are different questions. I think we must keep crypto bipartisan. I think the idea of it being nonpartisan is a myth, right? But I think I'd like to see it become post-partisan, if you will, right? And part of what Justin Slaughter and I wrote a series of op-eds throughout the last year and a half or so, I can't remember exactly when we started, but sometime last year in 23, where we were really making the case that crypto, it accommodates all different political philosophies and values. And I actually believe that is true. Those were, I think, very strong arguments that we were making. And we know that because they were heard arguments. We had a lot of members of Congress and staffers and others respond very positively to those, because they gave, I think, Democrats and progressives a reason to come on side with the technology in the wake of what they were hearing from other people who they assumed were better informed, but may or may not have been, right? So giving that reason. And the thing I will say, Amira, is I think you and I know this as well, you don't unring the bell of knowledge, right? People might make political decisions for their own calculus, but you don't unsee something that you know. And we don't see people moving backwards in their trajectory and understanding of why this technology is important and why it can actually improve lives, which is what I'm here for and what I know you're here for. I can't speak to everybody in our industry, unfortunately, but certainly that's what motivates me. And I think that you don't unsee it. You don't unsee that. So my hope is that knowledge will remain solid even as the political posturing continues to be crazy, because to your point, that's the time we're in. And we've been in that time for over a year, frankly. This is not new. I think it's gotten more prominent and a little uglier in the last 6 months during an election, a presidential, which is just kind of unfortunately the state of the world that we're in these days. But that was true. It's been true for a while. And so again, I hope that knowledge trumps, partisanship. And I hope that we're able to have those folks who, and this is true of everybody, who understand why this matters, sink into that knowledge, and then figure out what's the right thing to do for America and for people who live in America, as opposed to what's the right thing to do for my narrow political calculus. But, it remains to be seen. And I do think a lot of this is going to be dependent, let's be real, on the ideological issues where there's widespread disagreement between the parties. And on those, I think there's pretty much diametrically opposed views, right? And so as if you do see this kind of blue wall against some of the social agenda that soon-to-be President Trump has said he's going to move forward, and it's contained within Steve Scalise's, document as well, like very vividly out there and kind of at the top. If you see that positioning, it may be that bleeds over, into other areas where I do think that there is less political partisanship, or should be anyway, just because of the way that Washington works. So my hope is that does not happen. But, I don't know that we can predict what's actually going to manifest. And we're just got to be prepared for everything.
Sheila Warren, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Amira, for having me.